Some of the most popular films, the ones that are always at the top of the list, the greatest movies ever made, were all made here in Culver City. Citizen Kane, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Singing in the Rain. These movies were all made in our backyards. Our city ran out of water when Singing in the Rain was made. Like, this is our town, everyone. The film industry is one of the reasons that so many people came to Culver City, and one of the reasons that so many families have been able to be established and say they're from Culver City. Speaking of those families, our VP of Programs and retired prop master, Dennis Parrish, will be introducing our guest speakers for tonight. So thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the heart of Screenland.
95 years ago, my father decided to leave Akron, Ohio, and come to Culver City. A friend of his invited him out, and he said, the business is great out here, and working in films, it's just unbelievable. So my dad came out and started as an actor. Well, he quickly found out that was not his calling. So he moved into the prop department. And in 1935, he was in Catalina Island doing Mutiny on the Bounty with Clark Gable when I was born. So we have a history in Culver City and a history at MGM Studios. My father did over 20 years at MGM before he finally went on to do television at General Service, Bob Cummings' show, the Sky King, and a lot of other of the early television shows in the 50s. So that's where we were, the Parishes and MGM. My daughter, Hope, became the head of the prop department at Lorimar when Lorimar took over the MGM lot. So that's another foot in the door that we had at MGM Studios. Some of the films that I did personally as a prop master at MGM, The Goodbye Girl, Red Dawn, The Wind of the Lion with Sean Connery, Spaceballs with my good buddy Mel Brooks, Pennies from Heaven with Steve Martin, and The Sunshine Boys with George Burns. And during the film, Herb Ross told me, he says, you stay close to George. He was 83. And he says, if George looks like he's going to go, you grab him. Well, George lived to be 100 and I'm 89 and I feel better. You know, I don't know why I had to look out for George. Anyway, so The Sunshine Boys was one of the fun movies that I did with he and Walter Matthau. And the last thing I did for MGM was Solar Babies in Spain for Mel Brooks. Cora, they've introduced, and June Caldwell. Cora Sue, I'm sorry, Cora Sue. I keep forgetting. We have a memorial on the wall back there. We lost 3 of our locals here. One of that you probably didn't know was Emmett Walsh, character actor, you know, did over 250 films. He lived at Motor and Braddock in Culver City, and he'd walk all over Culver City. We'd see him all the time. He'd come over to Hope's house, and if there were people there, he'd give them silver pennies from World War II. I don't know where he got them. And $2 bills. He always had a pocket full of $2 bills. But he was a wonderful guy, and we lost him this year. So anyway, normally when we have a program like this, and this has got to be the biggest turnout we've ever had, but we're at Fire Department Max, so we have to kind of keep it quiet. But if I was able to get a guy like Stephen Bingen or Stephen X. Sylvester or Richard Adkins to do a program for us, and each one of those has done an individual program for us. But tonight, we've got all 3. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce the Steves and bring up Stephen Bingen and Stephen X. Sylvester and let them start this program on MGM, and we'll follow up with Richard Adkins on the cast. Okay.
Well, this is quite a crowd. Thanks for everybody for coming out. Before we start, I'm just kind of personally curious, how many folks here actually saw the studio when it was MGM? Okay, that's kind of what I thought. So you have an idea of what we're talking about. And I think one of the reasons MGM is such a big draw is because it has always been considered the best of the major studios during the classic Hollywood period. And I think it still resonates with so many people. The success of our book definitely proved that. And it was thought as the best by everybody else in the industry. So we're going to start out with a couple of quotes, short quotes from people who actually worked there to put it in perspective. Metro in those days was like being part of a very rich family. You had everything at your disposal. If you went from stage 1 to stage 9, you didn't walk, you took a limousine. If you had to go to the dressing room or the loo, you took the limousine. I mean, you never walked anywhere. If you were going to a premiere or something, you could go to wardrobe and take any clothes that would fit and sign them out for the evening. It was just a fascinating life. You were pampered and spoiled. That was Arlene Dahl.
I think my favorite is from actress Helen Hayes, who very much MGM was on their, they very much tried to make her into a movie star, and it didn't happen for about 40 years. But she was here in the 1930s, and years later she reflected it. She said, it was the great studio of the world, not just of America, not just of Hollywood, but of the world.
And we have one more here. The studio you worked for had a bearing on your social rating. A Paramount star outranked a Republic star, for instance, and a Metro star was top of the heap. MGM was the big studio. If you were an actor there, it was the equivalent of being a Harvard man, a pilot with a double row of ribbons, a Derby winner. This was true of all the departments: grips, best boys, cameramen, makeup men, electricians, wardrobe men. If you came from Metro, you were the elite. That was from Keenan Wynn.
Wow.
Now, as you all may know, Lowe's Incorporated was part of the MGM empire, and they owned about 150 theaters, give and take, mostly in urban areas, and they needed a constant amount of product. So they put together this fantastic studio so they could basically guarantee a movie almost every week. So let's start our tour. Well, one of the things I want everybody to keep in mind as we go through our tour, and we chose a period of the 40s because that's really when the studio was firing on all cylinders. But it's important to remember, this is a time when 80 million people went to the movies every week. Wow. So that gives you an idea why you needed literally an assembly line to keep pumping out movies. We're going to see that Lot 1 was 44 acres. Now Lot 1, of course, is still basically there, except now it's Sony Columbia.
Here we go.
Here we have the big merger, the actual day when it happened, which is almost exactly 100 years ago.
This was taken on April 27th, 1924. So we're hovering at the edge of the centennial. And about a week before that, they had a party to celebrate the fact that they were just about ready to incorporate.
Okay, so here's Lot 1. Again, this is the 44 acres, and a lot of this is still there. And this, again, is from the period we're trying to focus in on. And this, of course, is the original colonnade entrance. This beautiful building, part of the building, was restored many years ago when Sony Columbia took over the studio. And for many years, it was the main entrance. But when vehicles started getting bigger, it was no longer a viable entrance. So they started using a different one.
I think the last time that anyone ever drove through there was Esther Williams for That's Entertainment 3. And they had to go to Sony Pictures and rent their old lot back. And they had to find somebody who had a key to the lock on that iron gate there. So, there's the man.
This is Louis B. Mayer, of course, the man who ran the studio and was one of the individuals so key to the look of MGM. I had people tell me that worked there in the past that if a movie required something like a special boom or a special crane, and he was told that it would make the movie better, he'd say, buy it. This is another man responsible for the look of MGM, Irving Thalberg, who was also married to Norma Shearer. And this man had great taste. Unfortunately, he died very young. Who knows what had happened if he had lived a lot longer than he did. But he was also very instrumental in the high-quality historical dramas that MGM was famous for. And when he died, they had the good sense of building this wonderful building and naming it in his honor, the Thalberg Building. This is where all the decisions were made for the studio. All the executives were here. And now we're at the East Gate. This actually became the main entrance. It's not nearly as fashionable as the colonnade, but it's a little more practical. And you can see the guard shack there, Believe it or not, we're not making this up, but the guard that was there for decades was a man by the name of Kenny Hollywood.
He used to pick up the phone at the gate and he'd say, "This is Hollywood," and they'd say, "Yeah, I know. Isn't it Culver City? That's what I'm looking for." It was like an Abbott and Costello routine after a while.
Here you have the map, the layout of Lot 1, and you can see all of the different departments, and we're going to go through most of those so you get an idea what they look like. 30 stages altogether, and everything you would need from beginning to end to make a motion picture. And you'll see all of the different departments that MGM had to make this happen. This is the PR department. These individuals were very responsible for all of the advertisement that went out, all of these great posters that would have been in the lobbies of the theaters, some of them coming attractions, some of them the films that were actually playing there at the time. It's kind of interesting, some of the color ones were always about films that were shot in black and white.
Notice Margaret O'Brien's face has been pasted on after her stardom happened. It's in black and white. The rest of the poster's in color.
That's funny.
So this gives you an idea of some of the fantastic movies that MGM during this period was cranking out. And then, of course, the same department and the same talented artists that worked there were responsible for all the ads. And back in the day, these ads would have been all in all the movie magazines. And at one point, there was probably 20 or 30 different movie magazines that movie fans would read, on a monthly basis. And these ads would be in these wonderful movie magazines. And MGM, it seemed most of the ones that I've seen, they always paid extra, so their ads were right at the beginning of the magazine. The other studios were either in the mid part or towards the back. This is the billing department. This is where everything that the studio bought or sold came through. This, of course, is the wardrobe department, one of the biggest and best of all the studios.
I forget how many, what the number was. There was something like 7 miles of rack clothing there at one time.
Wow.
This is the leather shop. Looks like they may be working on the remake of Ben-Hur here, but they had some very talented artists that worked there and created all kinds of things in shop. This is the tailor department of the wardrobe. And this is the shoe department. You can't have a costume without the proper shoes to go with it. And this is the leather department as well, and here they are making a pair of leather shoes. I think it's a safe bet to say this is where the ruby slippers were probably, all of the different pairs were probably created in this shop.
Do you think that cobbler in the picture came to Hollywood to be a star?
I don't think so, but who knows. Here's the drapery department, and of course with all of the musicals that MGM was known for, drapes were always a big part of the set, whether on a stage itself or in the background. This is the Heidelberg building, one of the oldest on the lot. I think this goes all the way back to day one. As far as I know, it's still there.
Yeah, I think it was a military barracks at one point. So that's one of those buildings where there must be very interesting ghosts rubbing shoulders with each other in there.
And I think at one time too, it held like army uniform costumes in there.
Would not have been a bit surprised.
This was everybody's favorite department, payroll. This is where their checks were spitted out. State-of-the-art equipment there. But boy, oh boy, everybody was glad to get their check, I'm sure. MGM had its own police department, and here they are out on Lot 3. Looks like an inspection going on. And it's hard to believe, but these officers actually were all armed. I don't think that would be the case nowadays. This is the script department where all the scripts were kept, correlated, printed. And here we have the editing department, and back in those days, I'm not sure what it's like now, but a lot of women were actually in that department, I think because they had the great patience to work on film. Editing is a very time-consuming process.
MGM is often considered to be the studio that was most inclined to hire women and put women in positions of power. Ida Koverman was mayor's secretary for decades. So she was arguably, almost inarguably, one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, one of the most powerful people in Hollywood. And I don't know if that would have happened in any other studio. It's hard to imagine Daryl Zanuck, for example, hiring Ida Koverman.
Here's the music department where they're composing music for all of the musicals that MGM was so famous for. This is kind of a photo to give you an idea of the amount of employees MGM had. At its peak, it had about 4,000, And this, I think, was one of the many all-studio meetings that they would hold in some of the sound stages at various points in the history of the studio. I know in the early 50s they had a couple to tell everybody that revenue was way down, so we're going to have to cut back. So this was at some kind of all-studio meeting, it looks like. This was a wonderful trolley that went around and around on lot 2 or lot 1 that dropped people off no matter where they went, because 44 acres is a lot of walking. This is part of the MGM lab. This was another integral part of MGM's kind of hierarchy, having this wonderful lab. I don't think any other studio did that I'm aware of.
Some of the other studios had labs, but the Metro-Color, have you heard that phrase, was so prestigious it was used throughout the industry by many other studios. It was a slightly cheaper alternative to Technicolor, as I understand it, but it was also considered to be quality color that was unsurpassed pretty much anywhere else on the planet.
And cheaper than Technicolor.
Cheaper than Technicolor, but there's a lot of non-MGM movies for decades. You can see at the end, the last credit that would come on would be color by Metro-Color, which must have been annoying if it was a Warner Brothers movie and they had the credit MGM.
Here we have the wardrobe department. This is certainly big, tall prop masters. Look at this. This looks like a beautiful antique store, but it's just part of MGM's props. These are, most of them I would say, are probably legitimate antiques. I know for Marie Antoinette and other period films like that, MGM literally sent people over to Europe and bought various antiques. And of course MGM had the ability of making anything, so if they didn't have it, they would make it in-house. This is all silverware, antique clocks, again, all kinds of props to make historical stories come to life. Here we have a whole section of lamps from all different cultures, all different periods. Look at this hardware store. Doorknobs, locks, everything you could think of. That looks like twice what Lowe's or Home Depot would ever have. And this again is a part of the prop department. It's a mixture of things. It's kind of interesting on the wall there. Those cone-shaped things look like a sci-fi thing, and they're right next to the breastplates for Roman outfits. So it's a real hodgepodge.
We were wondering where to put this picture, because do you consider the breastplates a costume or a prop?
Right.
It's a costume. That's where they put it. But I remember when I used to talk to the prop masters, maybe someone else can help me out here, at Warner Brothers, they'd say, if a Roman soldier's wearing a sword, it's considered a costume. If he stabs someone with it, it's a prop.
Makes sense, makes sense. And speaking of weapons, here's the gun room. MGM had one of the absolute best in all the industry, and keep in mind, these are all real guns. They were used blanks, of course, but they were all real guns. MGM even had a gigantic collection of machine guns. The man there with the mustaches, Manny Zamora, he actually had a really interesting history. He was in the military and was always a arms expert. And he came to MGM, and he was a marvelous addition to the department there. He was actually called the gunsmith to the stars, because a lot of stars back in those days hunted, skeet shoots, whatever, and so he was constantly helping with their shotguns and rifles. This is the artificial plant and fruit department with the heavy lights in those days and all the heat it generated. Obviously real plants and fruit would not last, so the movie industry in itself was kind of key in really preparation of the artificial flowers and fruit. Here's the camera department. You can't have a movie without cameras.
I just had someone the other day call me up from the American Cinematographers Guild saying they'd found this picture in our book, Steve. And they said they really wanted, one of the cameramen there wanted to study it and find out what sort of a camera that was and what sort of a blimp it was in. And he asked if I'd send him the original on the picture. So I sent it to him. He promised to get back to us. So come back and everyone give me your email address when you're done. I'll send you the exact type of camera and blimp this is. I'm sure you're not going to be able to sleep wondering about this.
MGM also had a very popular portrait studio. That they turned out all kinds of photos of stars. And this guy shot most of the Dogville comedies, I think. This is a publicity shot for Jupiter's Daughter, Darling. And this is the actual lab that went with the portrait studio where they actually did their own in-house development. Here's the drying drum, some new prints coming off, and this is another part of the lab here. And then this is a process shot for the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. That's a glass plate, and all of that artwork on there was done by hand, painted on. And this is the MGM Fire Department testing out some new equipment. This is out the lake out on Lot 3. And here we have the research department, which of course was very, very important at MGM.
We have fans of the research library over here. They sent that collection over to Warner Brothers. I used to work as an archivist at Warner Brothers, and they gave me the keys to the old Warner Research Library. And it was the most fascinating years of my life digging through the dust of all this material. And a lot of it was production related, but they basically claimed that they could get you an answer to any historic question for any period on any subject at any time. So if you were making a gangster movie in the 30s and you needed to know what the manhole covers in Chicago looked like in 1933 as opposed to 1931 or 1939, they could find you photos and answer these questions for you within a few hours. So I suspect that even the Library of Congress and some of the other great libraries in the world probably wouldn't have been able to boast of doing something like that. And it was all right here in Culver City.
Now, of course, after all of this work going on, at some point you have to have something to eat. And this is the famous MGM commissary here, done in kind of a streamlined, modern design. Here we have a lunch break with everybody sharing all the studio gossip and having their lunch at the same time. And here's the cast from Tea House of the August Moon taking their break. And you can see even the placemats had an MGM motif on them. And this is a menu from the late 50s. And what's interesting is although Louis B. Mayer was gone at the time, they were still selling the MGM special chicken broth with matzo balls, which was supposedly Louis B. Mayer's mother's recipe.
I was in the commissary at Sony a couple of years ago, and they still offered that then. I don't know if it's the original recipe. They probably put less chicken in it now, but
it's vegan now, I think. MGM even had its own soda fountain, believe it or not, and that's that darling Jane Powell there making a sundae for somebody.
They have one of those at Sony too. Do we have any friends at Sony? Is the ice cream station store still there on their lot? I guess nobody here eats ice cream. We're all in here for something stronger.
And her dad owned an ice cream shop.
And like we're saying, that everything that you needed was on lot 1, and including a barber shop. And here we have kind of a make-to barbershop quartet, and the man in the middle is Gene Herschel.
Oh.
The MGM had a newsstand and a shoe shine stand. And this is another man very integral in the look of MGM. This is Cedric Gibbons. He was in charge of the art department. And there he is studying a mock-up of an upcoming set. But this guy was also responsible for the look of MGM, which was very important.
Mm-hmm.
He was, if you look at him on IMDb, he's got more credits than anyone else in history, because he was, in his contract, it was stated that any movie made in the United States had to list him as the art director, any MGM movie, that is. So think of how fast those credits ticked in. Of course, he also designed the Academy Award statue.
Here's the drafting department, and they're going over all the different qualifications for the sets coming up inside and out. You can see a model mock-up there at the lower part of the photo. MGM had an orchestra, which of course makes sense when you're making so many musicals. Other studios did too, but I know the room that they're in was considered one of the best rooms for acoustics when it came to music.
Sony has redid that room several times, but they're always very careful about keeping the original wood paneling in there because they don't want to mess with that beautiful sound. I think it's called the Barbra Streisand scoring stage now.
Of course, they had a makeup department. The man with the mustache over here is Bill Tuttle. The department was run for a long time by a man named Jack Dwan, and then Bill Tuttle took his place. And Bill ended up being, I believe, the longest running employee of MGM in its entire history. He was there literally right until the very end. There he's working on Toady Randall, and the man behind him is John Erickson. This is from the Seven Faces
of Dr. Lau. Tony Randall saw himself in that makeup. He said, "I look like something that hasn't been born yet."
This is the old dressing rooms for the stages, for the stars, that ended up becoming rooms for production assistants and writers. MGM in about 1938, I believe, built these beautiful apartments for their biggest stars.
Wow.
Here you have the women's apartments, and they really were self-contained apartments. You could spend the night there if you wanted to. You can see all of the stars that were there at this time. And a sad note up there where the letter A is, as you can see that at one point, Jean Harlow's name was there.
We didn't have a date for this photo, but we had to figure it was probably shortly after she passed away. And I think there's something indescribably poignant about that picture. They had to take her name down. You notice number C is also blank.
Yeah.
But we've looked at this picture with a magnifying glass and we've enlarged it. We can't figure out who was there, but it was someone that probably didn't pass away, but probably fell out of favor.
I think this is the woman that may have taken Jean Harlow's place, and that's Lana Turner there with an assistant coming out of her apartment. Here we have the men's apartment. You can see who was there at this particular time.
Quite a rogues gallery.
And here's Robert Taylor in his apartment. And then right next to the apartment is the school that they built for the kids. They had a smaller school at one time made out of wood, and then they made this beautiful Spanish-style school. Of course, by law, children actors had to go to school. So in between filming, they would come in here and hopefully learn their ABCs and some math. But if you look closely, it's kind of hard to tell, but the girl in the very middle of that grouping is the young Elizabeth Taylor. MGM had a hospital, had doctors, had nurses, even had a dentist. This was all part of being an employee. The phrase that you always heard over and over again from people who worked there was, "It's like a family. It's like a family." So people had all kinds of wonderful things to take advantage of while you were working for MGM.
They also used to say you could get anything you wanted on the lot without having to go across the street, except for a mortuary when you passed away, and there was a mortuary across the street. So
this is the building where the shorts came out of, all the short subjects that MGM was so famous for. They had the Pete Smith specialties, they had the passing parades, they had the Robert Benchleys, a lot of them were how-tos, and my favorite were the Barkeys, Dogvilles.
That's hilarious.
I really hope those dogs were well treated.
I hope they were too. I think they were. This is the rehearsal dance studio. Again, as we keep saying over and over again, known for your musicals, you've got a lot of singing and a lot of dancing. And this is where a lot of the practice took place before they got to a soundstage. This is a beautiful building. This is the Scenic Arts. This is where these talented artists would create these huge panoramic backdrops that they would use, that you'd see through a window or out through a door. This building, fortunately, was saved. At one time, it was slated for demolition, but it has been converted now, I understand, to an event center with all those wonderful lights there, or windows with all that skylight coming through. This is the saucer tank. This was done for a lot of underwater spectaculars. There was windows all the way around, so you could put a camera and cameraman to capture the action. But a lot of Johnny Weissmuller films were shot here, where he was wrestling with a crocodile. Esther Williams used it quite a bit as well.
Steve and I climbed the fence a few times. We're not supposed to say that, are we? When it was still there, and it was so touching and inspiring seeing that was still there. And it was used up until the moment they demolished it. They probably carted it off for scrap heap. But some of the later movies that were shot there, some scenes for Jaws were shot in there. And I think the last thing they shot there was the Barbra Streisand movie, Prince of Tides. So they were still using it up until the moment they tore it down, carted it away, and you know what they replaced it with? A Coke machine.
Actually, it was 2 Coke machines, but this is the mill, and MGM, of course, had a spectacular mill. And what made this interesting is this was actually an original stage that had been moved to where the mill became, with all of these wonderful windows and all that natural light that came through. Here's the same building. They're working on an elaborate staircase. And MGM even had its own neon department. So often when you see some of the movies, you'll see a street dressed on one of the back lots, and it'll be a hotel or cocktails or restaurant. All of that was done in-house.
Apparently, when they got rid of those neon signs, they drove a Caterpillar tractor through that room.
That's true. They were stored on Lot 3, and most of them were all bulldozed. On Lot 2, actually, in one of the warehouses there. This is the print shop. This is where you could make any kind of poster, any kind of playbill, any kind of ticket, whatever the script required. This is the staff shop. This is where they had molds and would make all kinds of things, statues, vases, light fixtures.
Apparently they could press out several hundred feet of phony brick wall within a few hours there on order.
Here you see some of the statues they made, and now they're adding some patina to make it look like they weren't just made. Now we hit the sound stages. Like we mentioned earlier, there was 30 altogether, and we're going to take a little walk through these and see what's going on. Oh, look, here's Brigadoon. And there you can see the backdrop there. That's one of the backdrops that was painted that we were talking about with that scenic art department. See, all that was a big, all hand painted. Absolutely amazing what they would do in those days. And now we see stage 6, and that was another unique sound stage because it actually had a theater within the stage, and they would dress it often as an opera house. Here you can see it as Clown Laugh, that's Lon Chaney. But all of those boxes aren't always there. You know, the Phantom stage that used to be at Universal, that was kind of always there in its glory. This was taken down and put up and taken down and put up. And believe it or not, even the boxes changed. They would go to the extent of redoing all of the boxes with a total different design or style.
Remember the climax of Singing in the Rain? I bet you thought that was in the Grauman's Chinese Theater, didn't you? It was actually shot on that stage, replicated to look almost identical to the actual Grauman's Chinese Theater.
Here we have that trolley that we showed earlier, helping people get from point A to point B. And you can see that just like today, bicycles are a big part of transportation on a movie lot. This is Invitation to Dance. That's Gene Kelly there dancing. And this is a fascinating photo to give you an idea of how many lights were needed back in the day. I think with the faster films, there's a lot less light required nowadays, but that gives you an idea of how many really were needed on some productions. This is another stage right across from the apartments that we saw earlier. And here we have the set for Cry Havoc, which was a kind of a World War II movie about women medics. And there is the classic golf cart, which is still used today on many a studio. This is stage 30, and this was the stage where MGM, with great expense, put in quite a few special effects for Esther Williams films. What they did is they added various hydraulics for fountains and for fire effects, and there's, I think in every one of her movies, at least one scene where there's almost like an aquatic ballet that takes place here. This is a break in filming from Neptune's Daughter, and that is Red Skelton there, right next to Esther Williams.
We won't have to tell you who's who.
And this is from Bathing Beauties, obviously kind of a Bugsy Berkeley kind of shot.
That stage again is still in use today. When you see an aquatic scene in a movie, they're probably shooting in that stage to this very day. For example, a lot of the scenes where Tom Hanks is adrift at sea in Castaway, that stage.
This is a set for Seven Brides of Seven Brothers, another case where they take the exterior and put it interior because it's so much easier to control all of the different elements when you're inside versus outside. Another one of the stages. This is a spectacular example of the detail of an MGM movie. This is Little Women. And the funny thing about this particular set is that when we were working to get the MGM book published, we sent obviously a lot of photos, and when we finally got the publisher, they sent us a mock-up of what the book was going to be and the title, MGM, Hollywood's Greatest Backlot. And they put a photo very similar to this on the front. And we had to tell them, that's an interior, it's not a backlot shot. But it was so realistic, they thought it was, and it is realistic.
We would have had a lot of egg on our face if they'd have went with that for cover, wouldn't they?
And there is that wonderful neon Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer sign there that was on top of the stage that had the theater and stage number 6. And just out of curiosity, does anybody have any idea what happened to that neon? It came down when Lorimar took over.
It went across the street, and then MGM, the current iteration of MGM has, the last I heard, they had it in a warehouse. I thought I told you the story.
But not this one, though. Not this one.
You don't think it's the original?
No, no, because I've seen that one. It's different. It came out when That's Entertainment came out, the one that's in storage now. This is a scene from Dr. Gillespie's new assistant, and that's a young Van Johnson there with his first or second role at MGM.
Wow.
And this is interesting along here, this wood storage area. This is where they would store a lot of the automobiles that were in various bits and pieces to do the process shots when people were driving, and then the projection was in back, showing the movement. They actually weren't in a car. Here's another process shot. This is Van Johnson in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. You can see the fan, and then that's the screen in back, and that creates the illusion of movement. The plane obviously is not going anywhere. And this is working on some of the special effects for the Witch and the Wizard of Oz when she disappears in a cloud of smoke. And here we have all the storage of all of the MGM productions. This was on Lot 1, but they also had huge refrigerators on Lot 3 that they stored a lot of their prints at as well. Temperature controlled, of course. This is their transportation department, how they move things from point A to point B, either on location or at the studio. This is at the tail end of Lot 1. This would be the west end of Lot 1. When the studio first started back in the early days, part of the studio on Lot 1 was all back lot. But as they kept making more and more movies and needed more production space, they moved it across the street, which we're about to see. But they left this tank of water there so they could still use it as ports. Here it is, and then here it is, more of a kind of a South American look. And here are the generators that kept all of this stuff going. Now the powerhouse is still there. At one point they bragged that these generators created enough power, I believe it was for 40,000 homes.
That's the number they gave out. I was never able to verify it, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt on this one, okay?
Okay, so now we're going to cross the street. We're going to cross Overland to Lot 2. And this is where all the magical back lots were, these gigantic, wonderful illusions.
See, we were almost in the picture. The building we're in was just off camera range. And
here's a reverse angle, and you can see how the entire lot, which was a total of 37 acres, was just covered with sets, and the juxtaposition was so interesting. We'll see here. Here's the map of it to show you the layout. All of the different facades had numbers for insurance purposes and for the art department, and a way of keeping track of everything. Our first set is, believe it or not, an ocean liner. Not an actual one, but a great mock-up of one. A fascinating set used in all kinds of movies, including Student Tour, Honolulu, Royal Wedding.
One of my favorites is Night at the Opera, of course.
And this is Don Adams.
Not the Don Adams, correct, Steve?
This is a publicity shot, but again, it just shows you how elaborate and detailed the ocean liner was. This was New England Street, later called Andy Hardy Street, because so many of the Andy Hardy films shot here. In fact, the Hardy house was right across the street, and here it is being dressed for Love Finds Andy Hardy. This was often called Carville in the Hardy series, but this was known as Small Town Square. And here we have a commercial district on the side. In the middle was a little park, and then a courthouse, and then over on the other side was the train station. All of this stuff was used in countless movies. It was built for a movie called Fury with Spencer Tracy, seen in Love Finds Andy Hardy, The Thin Man Goes Home, countless. That's one of the things to remember about MGM is, believe it or not, even though they had this reputation of being the biggest and the best, they also had really good production costs. And one of the main reasons is because they saved everything. And they reused things over and over and over and over again. All of these sets that we're seeing, they were used in 30, 40, 50, sometimes 100 movies, redressed, different camera angles. So we're just giving you a tiny, tiny fraction of how they were used. But that's why the book was called Hollywood's Greatest Backlot, because we both came to the conclusion that it was used more than any of the others. It wasn't the biggest. Fox and Universal's were bigger, but I think there was the most film shot there.
I think the estimate that we came up with eventually was that somewhere in the neighborhood of a fifth of the movies made in the 20th century were shot right here.
Here's the scene right in front of the train station. That's Strike Up the Band with Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. And this is the lake that was on Lot 2. This was used right in this photo. This is the Tarzan, the ape man. It's also used in Red Dust. Tarzan Escapes. And here's a scene from Tarzan Escapes, a break in the filming. This is Waterloo Bridge, which was interesting because the movie Waterloo Bridge never was filmed here. But it was seen in The Clock, Young, Rich and Pretty, and Gigi, among many others.
One of the last appearances it made on screen was in Young Frankenstein, actually.
This was the Three Musketeer Court, and this was actually the last outdoor full-sized facade that MGM built in 1948 for the movie. But it was used in all kinds of films, Scaramouche, Diane, everything with some kind of French or English theme to it. This is the same set used in Scaramouche. And this is an interesting facade. It took us a while to figure out what this was, but it was such a classic kind of derelict, abandoned, backlot set. It was so fascinating.
It's like the ultimate Hollywood Babylon photo. Look at the broken windows and the curtains blowing in the breeze and the ominous clouds in the background.
Well, it ended up being MGM's version of Versailles. This was built for Marie Antoinette, and this was just part of the set. They used a lot of matte paintings to give the illusion, and then they also built some facades on the left-hand side of this set. But if you ever see the movie, it's pretty convincing.
I remember we found that picture, we found that facade on aerial photos, but we didn't know what it was built for. But we knew where it was on the lot. You can even see it on the cover of our book, I believe.
This is Quality Street. This is another series of shops, and it's a village that basically represents almost any place in Europe. Used quite a bit, seen in Queen Christina, Marie Antoinette, and Random Harvest.
I think
this is the reverse angle, and as you can see, they've covered the cobblestone with dirt to give it a whole different look.
I think the last movie that ever used that, you could actually see it being destroyed on screen in a movie called The Stuntman. They told the director that he could actually drive a tank through the sets because they weren't going to use him anymore.
Yikes.
So in 1980, I think it was shot a little before that, but in 1980 that film came out, and you can literally see Quality Street being pulverized basically by a tank on screen.
I was on that set, Steve, and that was exactly what you're quoting. It was fun. And it was in 78, and it was released later on.
Yeah, it took a little while to find the distributor. Fox finally.
Here's the set in a movie called The Secret of Madame Blanche.
I'm so glad you're able to remember that title. I couldn't.
I am too. And here is MGM's answer to Grand Central Station. 3 train stations altogether. One we saw, one was very small for a real small town station, and then here we have Grand Central Station. And here's a different incarnation where it actually looks a lot more like Grand Central Station. Here they are filming Random Harvest with Greer Garson and Ronald Colman. This is the Chinese Street, which again, I was talking about the interesting juxtaposition. This was literally right next to Grand Central Station. And I just find that fascinating, that if you just move the camera 1 inch, it kind of ruins the illusion. This is another part of the Chinese set. And then on the opposite side was Joppa Square. So what we saw was on this side, and now this is the other side. This was used in a lot of movies, seen quite a bit in They Met in Bombay, which we see here. And you can see how the set was dressed for that film.
Joppa Square is the name of a location in the silent Ben-Hur. But I don't think they actually filmed it there. It's possible they might have moved some of the sets across the street when they expanded. But we've always wondered why it was called Joppa Square, but that name is actually used in the movie, so go figure.
Here's English House. This was used obviously for all kinds of movies that took place in England. Mrs. Miniver, 5 and 10, The Tale of Two Cities, The Canterville Ghost.
They sometimes call it the C. Aubrey Smith House after the British character actor. Apparently he lived there in every movie he ever made at MGM.
This is Spanish Street, and then right across is the other end of Spanish Street. This was one of the earlier sets, and we'll see here it's dressed for a movie called I Love My Wife. And then through sheer movie magic, we can see it dressed as Venice for Camille. And this is the stuff that fascinates me, why I'm very enamored with the history of these back lots, because the art direction is really magical. This is Verona Square. This was built for Romeo and Juliet, used in all kinds of films. Let's see, we've got Diane coming up here. You can see it's dressed for that film. And MGM had a real swimming pool on lot 2. This is for Living in a Big Way. And here we see it used for Everybody Sing. And right next to the pool was the Southern Mansion. And this was used in countless films. This is particularly set up for a film called Ada with Dean Martin and Susan Hayward. And this, a lot of people would never realize that this was a backlot set, but it was. This was called the Girls' School set. And it was often used as a school, as a reformatory, as a convalescent center, and often as a university, using the sets that are right around it, including the one over there on the side there. And it was very effective, but this was used countless number of times. Andy Hardy Meets the Debutante, Best Foot Forward, Tea and Sympathy, The Cobweb.
Originally, it didn't have that second floor, and I think they added that in the 50s, about the time of Tea and Sympathy. The second floor came, the towers that you see there came up. So it has kind of an early look in its earliest films. You have to look for it and kind of be able to pick it out. I'm hoping you guys are going to do that for the rest of your lives. You're going to be cursing us, because you're going to be recognizing some of these sets now that we've identified them for you.
This is the old mill, and this was built for where women meet.
When ladies meet.
Ladies meet. Also seen in Mrs. Miniver, and the last time I saw Paris. This is the Lord House. This was built for the Philadelphia story. And any of you familiar with the movie starts out with a little tiff between Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn at the door there. And it ends with Katharine Hepburn breaking a golf club and then Cary Grant shoving Katharine Hepburn over, but it took place here. This is Copperfield Court. This was built for the David O. Selznick version of David Copperfield, used in countless movies, usually as an English setting. And here we can see it set for the movie The Time Machine. This, I think, is a great panorama that just kind of gives you an idea, again, of the scope of the back lot. These is where all the New York streets kind of met with this park in the middle here. This is Park Avenue right here and here. This is Fifth Avenue here, and that street over there was Cullum Street, and then this street right along here, which we'll see, was Whipple Street. So they all came together around this wonderful park.
Altogether, the New York sets alone covered 8 acres.
So here's Whipple Street right here, and again, kind of an upscale tenement street in England. And here we see it dressed for the White Cliffs of Dover, which is a very convincing set. This is Waterfront Street, and some of the sets that we saw that were around that body of water on lot 1 were brought over here. because there is no water around here, so that is the reason why it was called waterfront. At one point, these facades were in front of water. This was often used for Europe countless times, and especially in American and Paris. Here we see the brownstone street. This is dressed for Comrade X, but this was used for countless movies. And those of you in the know will realize that this was the entrance to Uncle Headquarters.
You've got some fans there, Steve.
This is Fifth Avenue, MGM's version of it anyway. And take notice of the cables that are going across the sets up there. That was a system to be able to draw canvas, blackout material, to be able to film during the day, but to make it look like night. It made a lot of sense because you didn't have to deal with overtime that way. And you can see them there, they're kind of all lined up there, wrapped up. I don't think they lasted very long. I think they had to swap them out quite a bit because all of the sun and rain would have done a number on them. And this little facade right here used in a number of things, but the thing that I always remember it from is this is where the auction house was in North by Northwest.
Oh, wow.
This is a great shot where Park Avenue and Cullen Street meet. And this wonderful facade over here was often a hotel, and you'll see that quite a bit in the movie Showboat. This is East Side, West Side Street, and obviously it's a New York tenement street, but out here, right here is the corner, a curve, and that is where Gene Kelly did Singing in the Rain.
In case anybody's wondering where that is, if you go out the gate of Sony Pictures on Overland, across the street there's a little street called Palm Court, I believe, and a senior citizen center. If you went down that street, kind of with the senior citizen center on the left and the parking lot on the right, that's where Gene Kelly swung off that lamppost, by the way.
I think they would put a lamppost there.
I know, I think it's kind of a pet peeve of mine. There's not a plaque, there's not a commemorative statue or anything there.
I know.
Debbie Reynolds not have a street on that. She fought harder than anyone to keep that lot up, and she deserves a street.
Well, your point is well taken. I think you're preaching to the choir, though, Donnie.
I know.
This particular set was seen in San Francisco, Journey for Margaret, The Asphalt Jungle, and here it is dressed for Somebody Up There Likes Me. This movie starred Paul Newman, but some of you may know it was all set to star James Dean until his untimely death. He was actually signed to star in the film. So now we're going to go from East Side, West Side Street to Cartoon Alley. And where Cartoon Alley was right along in here. And the reason it was called Cartoon Alley is because this building right here is where all the great MGM cartoons were made. Here you see it from the street. Again, kind of a streamlined, modern, similar to the commissary. And here we see some of the talent artists there putting together the cartoons that became so famous. Tom and Jerry, I think, won 7 different Academy Awards. Here's a young Joseph Barbera and Bill Hanna before they went off to bigger and better things. And here are all the talented women artists that are filling in. They're adding all the color. It's the in-between work, which is very, very tedious, but obviously these folks have the patience to do it. This is Tex Avery. He made a whole different line of wonderful, popular cartoons there. And this is Fred Gwimby. Fred Gwimby was the man who ran the department pretty much the entire time. And there he is holding one of several Oscars that the cartoons won. Here's some samplings of some of the things they turned out.
We mentioned that Tom and Jerry alone had won 7 Oscars. Just to comparing baseball teams, Bugs Bunny at Warner Brothers and Mickey Mouse at Disney only won 1 Oscar each. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
So now we're going down to the intersection of Overland and Jefferson. And before we go into Lot 3, we see 2 other lots that MGM had, Lot 5 and Lot 6. And this is Lot 5. And what is interesting about this lot here, this is it right here, is over here you see horse stables and corrals. Well, Louis B. Mayer was quite an owner of thoroughbred horses, and back in those days the stars were very into horse racing, and many of them owned horses, I think in some cases for maybe tax reasons, but a lot of them were kept here. And then the rest of the lot was always used for storage of some kind. Pretty much every photo we've ever seen, it looks different with what's going on in there. Here you can see a whole bunch of lumber. It looks like they're getting ready to create a gigantic set of some kind.
I read a studio memo when we were going through the archives about how they were sending Elvis Presley over to that lot to learn how to drive a Caterpillar tractor for Jailhouse Rock.
Makes sense.
Hopefully he didn't run over anyone.
And then lot 6 we see here, at one time it was a nursery that would feed all of the needs of lot 3, but over time it ended up just being an empty lot. And I believe at one point there was a gas station right about here. I don't know if it's still there or not, but
What are the cross streets right now?
this is Overland here, and this is Jefferson. So we're at the intersection of those two streets. And now we're going to go into lot 3. This is the west end of lot 3, and here we have the east end. And this is basically twice the size of lot 2. Just to give you an idea, 65 acres altogether. And here's a map showing you the layout of everything. Again, everything had its own number. Our first set is Millbury Street. This was used in The Man with the Cloak, Kind Lady, 36 Hours. Again, another European setting that could have been almost in any place in the continent. This is Western Street, one of 3 that MGM had, but this was literally called Western Street. We're looking towards the west, and now we're looking east. Wonderful big town hall at the end there.
Town hall is always a great way to figure out if they're shooting on Western Street, because it hardly changed over the years. It always had that bell tower. So every time I see that in a movie, I grab the arm of the person I'm watching it with and say, look, that's Western Street in MGM. And they look at me like I'm crazy.
And here it is dressed for Cimarron, Western with Glenn Ford.
See my bell tower?
This is Monterey Street. This was often used for some setting in South America. At some point it was a concentration camp. But it was used in Twilight Zone, Strange Cargo, Tarzan's New York Adventure, Escape from Fort Bravo. And here it is dressed for the bribe. And you can see that South American look that was so realistic.
One thing we've never figured out is why it was called Monterey Street, though. If anybody has any input, we'd love to hear it. I think Strange Cargo was the first film we've ever found that shot there, and it was Devil's Island in that film, so go figure.
This is another one of the Western streets. This was actually built for Boomtown, but the street started being called Ghost Town, and Annie Get Your Gun and Westwood the Women, among many other things, were shot here. This is the third Western street. This is called Billy the Kid Street, which was built for the film of the same name. This was also in Annie Get Your Gun and The Hired Gun. This is set for Escape from Fort Bravo.
The TV series Rawhide used to use that particular set a lot too.
This is a very famous set. This is from Meet Me in St. Louis. And here it is right after the set was built. This set actually caused quite a schism within the studio. When the studio made the decision to make the film, the director, Vincent Minnelli, was adamant that they had to create this part of St. Louis to make the movie authentic and to give it depth. And the man we showed you a little bit earlier, Cedric Gibbons, in charge of the art department, he thought it was a gigantic waste of money. He wanted to just redress the Andy Hardy Street. Well, fortunately, Vincent Minnelli won that battle. And I think everybody agrees who's seen this movie that it's an integral part. It's a character in the movie itself. Here it is again dressed for Meet Me in St. Louis, and you can see how narrow the houses are because they were all shot basically from the front. And here we have an actual scene of the filming of Meet Me in St. Louis, and this man right here is Vincent Minnelli, the director. This is the lake, quite a bit bigger than the one we saw in Lot 2. This is a very early version of it before the vegetation really took off. This was built for Too Hot to Handle, Seen in White Cargo and Never So Few, among, again, many, many, many. Like I say, all of these sets were just used over and over and over again. One of the things that made it so interesting is it could be compartmentalized. So if you wanted to use a part of it, you didn't have to fill the whole thing up, which I thought was a fascinating kind of a modern twist on being very resourceful.
I'm sure some of you remember those oil derricks in the background.
This is the west end of the lake, and it gives you an idea of how you would access it, either through trailer or car. And you can see on the side there basically how deep it was, about maybe 4 or 5 feet. And this is Malaya. This is a film that gives you an idea of how tropical it could look. This was a film with Jimmy Stewart and Spencer Tracy. And this is the infamous UC Road.
I think it's called Yuki Road, Steve.
Yuki Road, lined with eucalyptus trees.
So you say eucalyptus, you don't say eucalyptus.
And so many, many, many films were shot here, including Pride of Prejudice, The Berkeley's of Broadway, Pat and Mike. This particular scene is being set for a film called Crisis, which takes place in South America. This is the waterfront street, and what's interesting about this big elaborate set, it was built for a Clark Gable movie that was never filmed, but it obviously was a tremendous set to use for upcoming films. Here you can see it, it was very instrumental in Showboat. Here you can see the Cotton Blossom. And this is MGM's version of the Mayflower for Plymouth Adventure. Both of those ships were docked there when they were not being used. And here's the processing tank, another example of pure movie-making magic. This gigantic tank was maybe about 3 feet tall, and this is the reenactment of the battle in the remake of Ben-Hur. And again, that backdrop is all painted by hand, and it changed with every movie. It had to depend on, what time of day was the shooting taking place, what did the scene call for. And they would have these very elaborate machines. They were basically parts of airplanes where they would fire up the airplane and the propeller would create these white caps and give the illusion. But this is all a model, and the model is on a cable, so they have control over it. But this is what would come out of their work.
What was that from? All the Brothers Were Valiant?
Yeah, I believe so, yes. That or Plymouth Adventure. This is the Kismet Steps. This was built for the film called Kismet. And here you can see the facade on the top. This is how it looked in the movie. And then that same set was redressed completely for American in Paris. You would never know they were the same. Again, these steps were in countless movies, often with a matte painting on the top of it, without even a set on it, but a matte painting of a hospital or a library, all kinds of different things. This is the Army base. During the Second World War, there was a tremendous need for movies that were based in the military. That's what a lot of people wanted to see. And so they created this wonderful barracks that was used in Escape, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, What Next, Corporal Hargrove. And next we have Dutch Street. This was actually built for a film called Seven Sweethearts. And it's a recreation of a Dutch town that is actually in Michigan. And the movie centers around the yearly Tulip Festival that takes place here. This is the other side of the set. And here it is dressed for Seven Sweethearts. And then this is another set that didn't seem to be used as often as some of the others. This is kind of a 1800s New York set. And they're obviously getting ready to use it because they're hosing it down to cut down on the dust. And this is the farm set. Again, this was used countless times. You've got corrals, you've got the barn, you've got the house, you've got a bunk house and another corral. Basically anything that you'd ever need for a farm setting. And this was in Excuse My Dust, Meet Me in Vegas, and The Mating Game. So now we're going to go right across the street to Lot 4.
Everybody tuckered out yet?
No, that's great.
And Lot 4 served two purposes. One was parking for Lot 3, but the more interesting thing was MGM Zoo. This is a map of the zoo facility. And here we see in the corner here how elaborate it was. With all of the animals that they were dealing with, especially during filming, the animals had a place to go. Instead of going back to their trainer or whatever, a lot of them would stay here. You had your own caretaker house and trainer here. You had all of these pens, and then you had this exercise corral right here. So all of the animals that MGM would use for Tarzan and various other movies were here at some point. Of course, with having a lion for your mascot, you certainly had a lions there more than once. And this cute cub is in front of the Thalberg building. You almost want to go out and hug him, don't you?
Would you think he'd purr if we gave him a hug?
Here they are doing the MGM logo, which they did several times over the years. And here are some lucky enlisted men that got a tour. And here we see some of the elephants that would have been there specifically for the Tarzan films. So after all of that, you're probably ready to sit down, take a break, because this is the end of our tour. And just so you know, this is the current version of the logo, and hopefully that'll be around for another 100 years. Unfortunately, it's digitally done instead of a real lion, but it looks beautiful nonetheless. We are going to take questions and comments after Richard's presentation.
There are a lot of people at MGM. So essentially, one of the brilliant parts of MGM was that, of course, it all starts with Marcus Lowe, who was a theater owner and was in legitimate theaters before getting into film. But he followed the trend and got into exhibiting movies, and he founded a small company called Metro. The only problem with Metro is that no matter, even though he had a large staff running it, they still couldn't get enough films and enough time to keep changing the bill as frequently as they wanted to. So that gave him the idea to combine and to purchase the Goldwyn Company and then eventually the Louis B. Mayer Company as well. In doing this, in one single move, they created the largest ensemble of directors, cameramen, stars, wardrobe people. Suddenly they had 3 times more of the creatives than any other studio had, and that began the impressiveness of MGM. All right, so to start with, just so you understand what the assets of these individual studios are, this will show you, these are the stars that were under contract to the Metro Pictures owned by Marcus Lowe. He then combined those with the stars from the Goldwyn Company, which he purchased. And you can see here, interestingly enough, that Goldwyn actually bought, and no pun intended, the lion's share of stars to the studio. And of course, the last ingredient would be the Mayer studio. You saw the last picture, also Irving Thalberg. Irving Thalberg, before joining the Mayer Company, had been at Universal. And he had been engaged to Carl Laemmle's daughter, but they didn't really like the union, so he had difficulty at Universal, so that he up and moved as Louis B. Mayer's right-hand man over to the new MGM. What I like about MGM is that some of their techniques started early. In the newspaper account of who were the stars that were coming to MGM, they actually counted everybody that was on the lot, whether they were under contract to MGM or not. So most of all the stars that are on the bottom were not really MGM stars, but they were actors who were working on the lot at the time of the merger. However, the whole concept of having more stars than anybody really appealed to Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg. And here you see one of the earliest promotional pieces explaining to the potential audiences, as well as the exhibitors and the industry in general, that MGM had more stars but they were in heaven. They hammered this home very hard to the exhibitors, the theater owners, and the audience. And here you see some literature from the period explaining that if you have these stars, you can have these great sales and attendance at your theaters. So you should hire MGM Films. There is obviously some truth to what they have to say, because this is a chart of every year from 1930 to 1940. All the yellow names are MGM performers. These are the top 10 performers in that decade. So you can see essentially half of the stars in that decade for movie going public were MGM stars. So that's why when you hear, you heard Steve talk about what the prestige was about being an MGM performer. This is why, because those films were the most popular at the box office. The whole family feel became something that Mayer kept promoting. Here you see the famous 1943 staff shot. And then again, they take the shot in 1949, in 54. And then, of course, the last shot, which was at the premiere of That's Entertainment. I particularly like this shot because Gloria Swanson is prominent in the front row. Gloria was only under contract to MGM for a couple of years, and the only thing she did while under contract to MGM, they loaned her out to RKO. MGM started its roster of stars with Anita Stewart. In the earlier years, they also did top 10 box office records, so that before 1920, Anita Stewart was one of those top 10 box office stars. Louis B. Mayer, when he started his studio, realized right away he needed a star. So he pitched Anita Stewart, who was at that time under contract to Vitagraph Pictures. And they came up with the reasoning that, well, because Anita's mother signed her contract and not the underage Anita Stewart, that it was okay for her to ankle or leave the studio and go to work for the Mayer Company. Only problem is, of course, as anybody knows, that if your mother signs it for you, she's your legal guardian. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to do that, honor that contract. But they went to court over it, and the judge agreed that Anita had to actually do films for both studios. However, she would not get financial compensation for the films she did at Vitagraph that she essentially walked out on. Eventually, Anita Stewart regained her popularity at the company for a short time, but then she made the fatal mistake of wanting to do a movie about a prostitute, which is one of the great big L.B. Mayer no-nos. You don't make fun of mothers. Here you can see another MGM advertisement where they list all the stars they have, and you'll see in the close-up, they made sure that we understood that Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer made this star. Now, Jackie Coogan had been a star before this. You remember this little film called The Kid with Charlie Chaplin? And that's before Mayer made him a star. So there was some dubious exaggeration with some of the MGM stars. The one thing that I want to point out about MGM is that it isn't just the stars, but how they equip themselves to be able to promote and package those stars. And this included makeup, hairdressing, costuming, photography, all those features that help make their stars look good. Steve and Steve talked a little bit about Cecil Holland, and here you see Cecil Holland, who had come via the Goldwyn, the studio. Max Factor, although he didn't work at the studio, MGM sent their stars to Factor to be made up. There are lots of, unfortunately, unknown people who worked in both the makeup and the hairdressing department that we rarely ever know. But in some cases, the studio did promote them. Lillian Rosine actually had to be set out as an actress, but they found out that she could actually do a really good job making up the other actresses that were working on her films, so that she became part of the makeup department rather than being an actress. You can see also here that that Monty Westmore from the Westmore family was on staff at MGM. The Westmores were an interesting makeup family. That at one time in the mid-30s, they boasted that Westmore was at every studio in Hollywood, and it was true. These are just some highlights by decade of some of the designers that were working on the MGM lot. But in truth, this is all the designers that worked throughout that time period. That MGM was kind of a revolving door for some designers. For instance, Sophie Walkner and Ethel Chapin had come from Goldwyn, and they were essentially your old-fashioned wardrobe lady kind of person. And that the MGM, like many of the other studios, wanted more prestigious designers. So then, as was very popular in the 20s and before, they needed French designers, even if they weren't really French designers. When Gilbert Adrian came to work for MGM, they advertised him as their new French designer. He was from Connecticut. But Adrian sounded a lot like Erte, and MGM had just had a very bad experience hiring and then letting Erte go, because Erte thought himself better than the actresses he dressed, and they were constantly in conflict with one another, specifically Lillian Gish. When she made the La Boheme for MGM opposite John Gilbert, Erte designed her costumes out of cotton because, of course, that's what a poor person would wear. Maybe it was a poor person. Of course she's wearing cotton. Lillian Gish said, oh no, they're not. They're made out of silk. And so that in defiance of Erte, Lillian and Sophie Walkner remade her costumes at night out of silk. And that's what she wore in the movie. Adrian designed most of the MGM films in the 1930s, but they kept adding people in order to lessen his load. When he left MGM in 1941, they had to hire more designers than they had before he left. Jenna Gaynor used to boast that when her husband left MGM, they had to hire 5 people to replace him. MGM had an enviable reputation for hiring extremely skilled photographers. Here you see a sampling of the photographer's work, and particularly that work with the stars themselves. How photography worked into the system is that if you were hired by MGM, no matter what particular field you had come from, the first part of the star build-up process was to photograph you and get your picture in papers and in movie magazines. If the response was good for your photograph in a magazine, then you would get a small role. If you did well in that role, then they would give you that build-up. The studio had the benefit of long-term contracts, which would allow them the time to build you into a more notable personality. Now, you'll hear a lot about the 7-year contract system, but they weren't all 7 years. They could be anywhere from a year to 7 years. And sometimes, like, if you didn't really work out within that first year, you would most likely not be offered an additional contract. Art direction is also a very important part of the MGM appearance. MGM had Cedric Gibbons, who once again had come from the Goldwyn organization, and headed up the MGM art direction department. And as the Steve's pointed out, by contract, received credit for every film that was made at MGM, whether he was the primary architect or not. One of my favorite MGM stories is in the lower left-hand corner. You'll see that fabulous rotating pedestal from the great Ziegfeld. This was designed by John Harkrider, who had been hired by the studio kind of in secret because Gibbons didn't like competing art directors on a film. So that, according to Harkrider's autobiography, that he built this set in secret so that Cedric Gibbons wouldn't know. I'm not sure how you build that in secret. I think possibly Cedric knew, but of course Cedric had the last laugh and that he got the art direction credit in the film. Another example of the great artistry of the MGM set design department is that in this Coliseum-style scene from the silent Ben-Hur, none of those people on the upper decks are people. They're little wooden figures that are manipulated by sticks on the side by prop assistants. This is what's called a hanging model. So that the columns and of course the charioteers are real, but all the people except in the lower gallery are fake. The other thing that I tried as much as possible to put as many of the art directors, because these are kind of unsung heroes in most every studio. And this is not even the prop people. These are all the art directors or set decorators from the MGM movies. Stars, of course, are what seem to drive MGM the most. And what's interesting to review is like, well, where did they come from? Well, in this case, a lot of them were international. It was tradition for all the studios to tour Europe or have somebody for them, agents tour Europe, find out who was popular in Europe, and then try to get them to come to the United States and specifically to MGM to work. Of course, one of the reasons for doing so is that when film is all silent, it didn't matter what their voice sounded like, because you could change the intertitles from one country to the next with the greatest of ease. So in some cases, you might even have a situation where, you know, there was at least one case that I know where Victor Seastrom is the director, you know, and he speaks Swedish. Unfortunately, the leading lady only speaks Austrian, and so that they didn't necessarily get along. But as the audience, we never saw it, so we kind of didn't care. For a short time during the transition from silent to sound, it was necessary for the stars to be able to speak a foreign language. So some of these foreign stars that were imported to MGM prior to sound, stars like Lily Demita, they actually did the foreign language version of another MGM player's films. For instance, Lily Demita did all the Norma Shearer films, but in French. But she starred in them because these were before looping, so that these were called parallel language films, which meant that they would work on the same set that Norma Shearer did, but she would have different costumes because she was a different size, but it also meant that set had to stay up for as long as they had to complete those different foreign language films. There's at least one film, John, the Big Trail, parallel language film, which was made in 13 different languages. I want to see the MGM accountants try to figure out how they're going to keep up a set for 13 films. But that's how they did it. Luckily, some of the MGM stars could actually speak other languages so that they were able to do the foreign language versions of their films. Ramon Navarro, for instance, spoke French and Spanish and English, so he would do all the foreign languages versions of his films. Even Jeanette MacDonald, when she arrived at the studio, spoke French, and Greta Garbo spoke German as well as English. So that sometimes the original stars would do the foreign language films, and sometimes the foreign language films would actually do better at the box office than the English ones. Yeah. So that, but when Douglas Shearer perfected looping, then it was no longer necessary to do the foreign language films. All they had to do was change the dialogue tracks for the actors, and then be able to distribute those films in a foreign country. One of the great things about MGM is they managed to attract the sports heroes and popular athletes to be in the MGM films. So like you have, from upper left, you have Johnny Mac Brown, who was a championship football star, became an actor. Here you see him with Joan Crawford. Johnny Weissmuller was an Olympic swimmer who became an MGM star, became Tarzan. Frank Shields, who was a tennis champion and Brooke Shields' grandfather, worked at MGM doing films there as well. Oh. Wrong. Okay, sorry about that. Although you can see where Brooke Shields gets her good looks. For Prize Fighter and the Lady, it not only started heavyweight champion Max Baer, but also Primo Carnera and Jack Dempsey, other championship boxers. And then, of course, Esther Williams, who unfortunately wasn't able to perform in the Olympics because of the war, but who nonetheless won a lot of U.S. titles and became a very big star for MGM because she could act as well as swim. Particularly during the transition to sound, a lot of stars came from the theater. Because while MGM and other studios were still testing their existing silent stars to see if their voices were acceptable in film, they also had to have product in the theaters as rapidly as possible. So they began hiring performers from the stage. Gene Eagles appeared with John Gilbert in Man, Woman, and Sin. Here you see Alfred Lunt and Lynn Fontaine and the Guardsmen. Wallace Beery actually started out on the stage, and then worked for Max Sennett as a part in films where he portrayed a Swedish washerwoman. Don't ask. Helen Hayes was imported from the stage. She won her first Oscar in an MGM movie, The Sin of Madeleine Claudet. The Barrymores had actually been doing film for some time, with Lionel specifically directing as well as acting. But in the 1930s, all three of the Barrymores worked at MGM. Eleanor Powell started on the stage as a dancer in the George White Scandals, and then was imported to MGM to do films like Rosalie and Born to Dance. Gene Kelly was recruited from the Broadway stage after he had made a big hit in Pal Joey. Fran Chatone was a Broadway star. Buster Keaton was part of his family vaudeville act known as, I believe, the Tumbling Keatons, where they kind of used Buster as a juggler's toy. And then Chester Morris became a hit on Broadway right at the transition to sound and was imported to be in MGM films. One of the other unique things that MGM was able to do is like occasionally a star wouldn't be able, they were either sometimes on the way down, on the way up, or couldn't get a break at the studio they were with first. Lillian Gish, who had been with the D.W. Griffith Company for a long time, transitioned to MGM because at that point she was probably one of the best known film actresses. And she did great work at MGM, The Wind, and a couple other films. Jean Harlow, when she started the films, Howard Hughes didn't really know what to do with her after Hell's Angels, so he loaned her out to other studios. He was, according to legend, he was looking for a kind of a nickname, trade name he could use to help market Harlow, and she was lent out to so many other studios that someone suggested that he should call her the Borrowed Blonde. Marie Dressler was one of those people who actually, Gloria Swanson once said that you're not a star after one comeback. You have to have at least 3 to 5 comebacks, then you're a star. Marie Dressler fit that description quite nicely. She had been a stage star, then she had done started for Max Sennett in the very first feature-length comedy film, a film called Tilly's Punctured Romance. But then she was in decline. The films weren't as popular. She went back to the stage. And somehow in the interim, she had befriended Frances Marion. So that when Marie was having a hard time getting roles, Frances Marion recommended the MGM office to hire her. And then within 2 years, she was one of MGM's biggest stars. Lucille Ball had previously been at RKO, doing a lot of small films. MGM saw potential there, and Lucille Ball became a bigger star at MGM than she had been previously at RKO. Myrna Loy was suffering from typecasting at Warner Brothers in Oriental roles and exotics, so that she came over to MGM, and it started in a little thing called The Thin Man. And so she moved very rapidly from being a Chinese vamp to being, Nora, of Nick and Nora. And although they did put her in the Mask of Fu Manchu as another Oriental. Lon Chaney had been a top 10 movie box star for Universal, but saw a better break for himself at MGM and came to MGM. Jeanette MacDonald had been both at Paramount and Fox and was looking for an opportunity to do better, and conferred specifically with Louis B. Mayer. Fred Astaire had sort of an on-screen test when they put him opposite in a sequence opposite Joan Crawford in Dancing Lady, but the studio chose not to hire him because the preview cards reviewing Astaire's performance in Dancing Lady were primarily negative. One of them specifically saying, balding, can't sing, and dances a little. So that he went on, of course, to be a star at RKO with Ginger Rogers, and came to MGM with a lot more pride on his side. The other stars in the MGM stratosphere came from lots of different opportunities. Certainly in the 1950s and 60s, Elvis Presley became a big star for the studio. Interestingly enough, at least 3 decades of popular singers, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, and Elvis Presley, all MGM stars. Katherine Grayson came to the studio because Katherine Grayson was in the same vein as Jeanette MacDonald, and that since the 1920s, operettas had remained a popular movie form, which is the same reason they hired Nelson Eddy. And Miller had worked at other studios and was a successful dancer, as was George Murphy before he became a politician. The Marx Brothers moved from Paramount over to MGM. And Laurel and Hardy, although technically under contract to Hal Roach, a lot of the Roach films were released through MGM, and then MGM also used them in their own films in comedy sequences within bigger and better films. And of course, Red Skelton kept helping MGM update its roster of popular comedians. One of the best ways, of course, that MGM developed stars was they essentially grew them. Joan Crawford was spotted by an MGM scout on Broadway in a chorus line of a play called Innocent Eyes. And so they signed her to a $200 a week salary, took the train out to California, and, as they say, the rest is history. After 2 or 3 years, she played opposite Lon Chaney, opposite John Gilbert, opposite William Haynes, all the regular MGM stars, without necessarily becoming a big star herself. But then they put her in Our Dancing Daughters. And with the success of that film, aided by a description by F. Scott Fitzgerald that Joan Crawford was the epitome of the modern American flapper, that Joan Crawford raised from the ranks and became a big star. Well, what's interesting about Crawford is that she changed from that careless flapper of the 1920s into the hardworking shop girl in the 30s and maintained her popularity. The only reason Crawford wound up leaving MGM is that her salary had accelerated so much that it was kind of difficult to be able to afford a film where the writing and all the art direction and the performers were still affordable within her range, so that she went to Warner Brothers, and I'm sure much to MGM's chagrin, she became a star there as well as getting her first Academy Award. Clark Gable had been an extra, been kicking around for a number of years. If you'll see the silent film Merry Widow, he's dancing in the ballroom scene. But it wasn't until after the transition to sound that Gable's voice matched his appearance, as opposed to John Gilbert, whose voice didn't match his appearance, and he did not. Gilbert did not maintain his MGM stardom, whereas Gable went on to be kind of probably the most popular male star in modern film history. Mickey Rooney started in vaudeville as Joe Yule Jr., became a child star at MGM, and continued to grow in popularity until he became MGM's, one of their leading male players in the 1940s. Same can be true of Judy Garland. Her remarkable voice, particularly in Broadway Melody of 1938, where she sang to Clark Gable, that Judy Garland moved in ranks from a minor player to a major player at MGM. At one point, MGM had both Deanna Durbin and Judy Garland at their studio, and they had to make a choice between the two, and they decided on Judy. Not that Deanna did terribly, poorly for herself. She became the leading player at Universal and is credited for helping that studio survive some lean years. And then, of course, one of the more recent, one of the last studio system MGM stars who started as a child star would be Elizabeth Taylor, who started in National Velvet as a child star, and then within 20 years is doing Butterfield 8. One of the things that MGM liked to do is they liked to have a fallback position. Part of this was a financial consideration. For one reason, the star became uncooperative or difficult to handle in one way or another. They had two choices. They would either send them to Columbia, or they would, which was considered a low-cost studio and an embarrassment if you were sent to Columbia, or they would find somebody else that they could develop to fill in for that star who was difficult. And these are the days in which there's actually, if you had a contract with the studio and for one reason or another you did not want to do that movie, you would go on suspension. That suspension period would be added to the end of your contract. So that even though you had a 2, 3, or 7-year contract, you turned down enough movies, you could wind up on a 10-year contract. And some of the stars did this willingly. Once when Joan Crawford in a live interview was asked, why she made so many bad movies, and her answer was, "You should have seen the ones I refused to make." So that in the early 1930s, Lawrence Tibbett and Grace Moore were MGM's operetta duo. But the problem was that Lawrence Tibbett wanted to continue his stage opera career, and Grace Moore her weight fluctuated, and that was a big bozo no at MGM, having your weight fluctuate. So that they didn't renew Grace's contract. However, the studio had already purchased New Moon and Naughty Marietta and Merry Widow, and so they needed another operetta duo. So that the hiring of Jen McDonald and Ness Laney allowed the studio to be able to utilize the properties they'd already paid for. When Myrna Loy turned down roles, those roles were almost automatically given to Rosalind Russell before the studio realized that Roz Russell could be funny. Once Roz Russell got to be funny, she never played another Myrna Loy part. Greta Garbo in the late 1920s, her films alone represented 60% of the studio's income. So they were concerned with being that dependent on an individual star. So that when Irving Thalberg and Norma Shearer were on the honeymoon in Austria, they saw this photograph of a woman in the dance studio, and they hired her on the spot, brought her back to the United States, and tried to mold her into a second Garbo. Unfortunately, she was the actress that didn't speak English with the director that didn't speak Austrian. Unfortunately, the Eva von Bern kind of was that movie cliche of that she knew 2 words in English, swell and lousy. So that unfortunately, she also wasn't a good enough actress to put her in the parallel language films, so that after only being at MGM and starring in a John Gilbert film, they sent her back to Europe. The good news for Ava was, however, that after having been in an MGM film with John Gilbert, when she went back to Europe, she did several more films in Europe quite successfully. Gable had the most fallback position actors at the studio. Both James Craig and John Carroll were there, particularly when Gable was off during the war years. During the war years, MGM, they lost James Stewart, they lost Robert Taylor, they lost Clark Gable. So they hired kind of actors that they hoped would grow into those roles. That's when they hired Robert Sterling and other actors in the same ilk who physically resembled Robert Taylor or Clark Gable, but whom the studio hoped the studio actually believed that they could make stars, which wasn't always true. Norma Shearer, after the death of her husband Irving Thalberg, wasn't really all that eager to continue her career. And she particularly didn't want to do any films where she had to play someone's mother. So that when the studio wanted to make a Mrs. Miniver, that Norma reportedly turned it down. She also didn't want to do dramatic films like Madame Curie. So that Greer Garson, a recent hire of the studio, was a natural fit and fill-in, so that when Norma retired, Greer's star ascended. Not that Greer wasn't a good star to begin with; she was a great fill-in. In the mid-1940s, starting in the late 1930s, theater owners began to balk against the studio's booking system. What that meant specifically is that since the movie studios owned some of their own theaters, they would reserve the better films to be shown in their own theaters. So that if you were an independent theater owner, you got you either paid a lot of money for the premium MGM films, or you took the B's and C's. Well, the independent theater owners thought this was an unfair practice, and eventually they brought suit against the studios, but not before placing this wake-up ad in the Daily Variety, with the hopes of explaining to the studio owners that, the fans, the movie goers, weren't going to as many Joan Crawford films as they had hoped, or Marlene Dietrich films, or Greta Garbo films, or Mae West films. So that they placed this ad, and even though they weren't really trying to diminish the stars, they were trying to fight the block booking system. It caused a lot of trouble within the studio. Luckily, almost all the stars named in this particular ad wound up having best-selling films within the next few years. Box office poison Katharine Hepburn did that little film called Philadelphia Story. Mae West did My Little Chickadee. It didn't really hurt the stars necessarily named. The other thing was that Olivia de Havilland and Bette Davis both had filed suit against Warner Brothers, trying to end the 7-year contract system, saying that 7 years is a calendar measurement. Therefore, you shouldn't be adding suspension time to the end of my contract. Bette Davis lost the suit. Olivia de Havilland, however, won it in 1944. But she still had to take Warner Brothers back to court one more time before the essential 7-year contract with suspension added at the end was ended. The good news for the studios, of course, was that during World War II, even though the Supreme Court consent decree decision, which decreed that movie studios could only operate in 2 out of 3 areas, production, distribution, or exhibition, that they didn't enforce the decree during the war years. They didn't enforce the decree until 1947. Of course, by the time you get to 1947, television has started to rear its ugly head, and theater goers, just like radio had done in the years before it, that the audiences could stay home and watch sponsored shows and not have to leave the comfort of their own home. So that essentially was these political acts on top of the growth of unions essentially diminished the income for studios and would eventually lead to their decline, including MGM.
Before we take some questions, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. This same year, 2024, is also the 100th anniversary of Columbia Pictures, which of course is kitty corner from us now. They used to be in Hollywood, but now they're here in Culver City. And the other thing is we wanted to be sure to thank Mark Wanamaker, Bison Archives, David Warden with the Warden Group, and Donovan Brandt with abcdvdvideo.com with the help in our presentation. So thank you, folks.
We had a slide with their names on it, which we forgot to protect. So I'd also like to acknowledge Donnie Norton over there, who's the true phantom of Hollywood, everybody. Okay, any questions, queries, sarcastic comments, anyone? Yes.
At one time, I heard that MGM made so many movies, they actually released one film a week. So my question is, how many features did MGM release from the time that they were established to, I don't necessarily know what ending point to use. Sometimes I use when United Artists merged with the studio, or sometimes I use the date May 31st, 1986, around the time that Ted Turner bought the studio. So you tell me what ending point I could use.
Well, basically, MGM made just under 2,000 films, and it was right around 75 when technically MGM, when the merger took place, and it was no longer just an MGM film, but just under 2,000 films, if that answers your question.
We lost a lot. We lost a lot with the nitrate.
Yes, there are some that we would love to get a hold of. So if anybody have any old MGM movies in your attic, please bring them down and give them to me.
Convention City.
Convention City is a Warner Brothers film, but I get your point. We can read and write about this stuff, but having some people that were there, like we have in the front row, is fascinating and priceless.
1942. I just want to say that's when I started. I was born in 1924 when the studio was. And then I started at 17 for a job as a secretary to W.S. Van Dyke, who had made all these wonderful trader horns and white clouds in the South Seas, and also Eskimo. The first time they went out to all the different places, and he shot those. So anyway, he was a very interesting man, and I was 18 when I started with him, and he was doing Journey for Margaret with Margaret O'Brien, and he died 2 months after. So that's the only time I had with him, plus I have his books of what he wrote on Trader Horn and everything. And then I was on the reception desk and casting and in the Thalberg building, and then I worked 15 years for Edgar J. Mannix, who was operations head, vice president, and he was the one that took care of all the business, the managers from every department, and that was for 15 years. So you can imagine how interesting the office was. And L.B. Mayer was right next to us in the center. And L.B. Mayer walked that lot to go he was as much down on the lot as Mannix was, watching the shooting and the operations of what everybody was doing, and to answer and take care of the business side of whatever they needed. So that was a wonderful beginning. Plus I was a messenger to begin with, where that's when all the men left to go in the service, 1942. That's why I got a chance to be a messenger and deliver the 6 lots you mentioned by tram. So I had a great beginning to understand what was in the studio. And I left for 15 years and I came back. I'll shorten Turner Classic Movies. We developed with Turner Entertainment Co. Mr. Roger Mayer formed it. Ted Turner came in and bought the studio from Kilgore. So he came to us and said, "What did I buy?" And Roger had to explain the films you're talking about, the number, and that was when we were starting to color the black and white, trying 3 different companies, because people were watching television. They weren't interested in the black and white selling it. And so I was with him 20 years. Well, Turner started TBS, CNN, TCM, cartoons, you know, Hanna-Barbera, and then he had his own TV network, TNG. So anyway, we worked till 2005, 2006, when it merged with Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers took the film after we serviced it and delivered it. So it was very interesting life.
Thank you. There's our next book, boys. I have a question for you. I have a question for you. Did the tour bring back a lot of memories?
It was wonderful that all these people from all over the world came to our office, and I, you know, was able to have the exposure to it. Arthur Freed was wonderful. Oh my gosh, the musicians that he had, working with them, Solly Chaplin and all of them, and they were so creative. I was off 15 years, and I just want to say it was a shock to come back to the executives being all attorneys, not the creatives.
Don't get me started.
That was
New Hollywood.
But your presentation and yours was wonderful.
June Caldwell, a Culver City star. Everybody got their tickets.